Early winter of 1893 brought a biting cold to the remote mountain valley where 19-year-old Samuel had settled. Unlike other young men of the settlement who huddled in their cabins and depended solely on their fireplaces for intermittent warmth, Samuel proposed sleeping directly beside the hearth through the night. He insisted that by remaining close to the fire and arranging stones around it to radiate heat steadily, he could endure the cold far better than anyone else in the community. The idea was met with widespread skepticism. George and Charles, who shared nearby cabins, laughed openly at what they considered an unnecessary and peculiar habit. "You'll be frozen by morning," muttered Charles, shaking his head as he stomped through the first dustings of frost along the valley floor. Samuel's cabin itself was modest, a simple log structure with gaps patched by straw and clay. Yet he had carefully chosen its orientation to maximize exposure to the sun during the day, while shielding the entrance from the prevailing northern wind. Each plank and stone was positioned with deliberate intent. While the valley's residents hurried to complete their own preparations, Samuel moved slowly and methodically, stacking stones near the hearth and clearing space for his bedding to remain within the direct reach of the fire's warmth. His movements were quiet, almost imperceptible against the whisper of the wind through the bare branches surrounding the cabin. As he worked, the first frost settled on the window frames, glistening like brittle crystal in the pale winter light. The community observed him from a distance. Neighbors had already started their routines, checking the seals on their doors and reinforcing their own cabins, but they did so with visible impatience and murmured criticism. They did not understand why Samuel would choose such an unconventional method. Some shook their heads, others laughed softly, and a few, like Frank, muttered under their breath, "A strange plan, and yet he insists upon it." The mockery, however, never reached Samuel's ears in a way that disturbed his focus. Inside, the fire crackled, casting long shadows across the stone and timber interior. Samuel arranged his bedding near the hearth, careful to leave a narrow path for access to the doorway. Every item in the cabin seemed to have its purpose, its place calculated to conserve heat and minimize loss. He paused occasionally to examine the stove's output, noting how each stone absorbed the warmth before slowly releasing it into the room. The approach was deliberate, patient, and based entirely on observation and preparation rather than impulse or belief. The biting wind outside promised the severity of the coming months, and Samuel's eyes lingered on the drifting snow and the skeletal branches beyond his small window. Despite the quiet derision surrounding him, he prepared as though the entire winter depended upon this arrangement, which, in practical terms, it would. Each careful adjustment of stone, bedding, and position was an experiment in enduring the cold efficiently, methodically, and without reliance on any fortuitous circumstance. The neighbors might have mocked his peculiar habit, but Samuel's actions followed a clear logic that would soon be put to the test by the harshness of the mountain winter. Every night that passed with the fire burning and his position secured beside it strengthened the foundation of what would later become an undeniable demonstration of foresight and resilience. Samuel rose before the first light of dawn, the air sharp and still, carrying the faint scent of frost from the valley floor. He began his work systematically, carrying stones from the small pile near the cabin's entrance and arranging them around the hearth in a precise formation intended to retain and radiate heat through the long winter nights. Each stone was placed with deliberate care, ensuring that no gap remained where cold drafts could penetrate. The floor, previously bare, was layered with straw, thick enough to insulate against the chill rising from the frozen ground beneath. The The cabin was simple, yet every adjustment reflected Samuel's intent to control the environment in small, practical ways. Outside, George and Charles moved from cabin to cabin, inspecting the timber walls and checking the seals around doors. They spoke in low tones, sometimes laughing quietly as they glanced toward Samuel's cabin. "Still at it," muttered George, shaking his head. "All that work for a fire that won't change the weather." Charles added, "He'll be shivering by the time night falls. Mark my words." Their voices carried only briefly, dispersed by the crisp mountain air, but their presence underscored the scrutiny Samuel faced. He acknowledged them only once, a brief nod, then returned to adjusting the stones and smoothing the straw on the floor. The frost on the window panes thickened as the morning light rose over the ridges of the surrounding mountains. Small crystals formed along the edges of the glass, a visual indicator of the temperature outside. Samuel paused occasionally to watch the patterns, noting where the cold crept first and where it lingered longer. The arrangement of his stones, the layering of the floor, and the careful positioning of his bedding were all responses to these subtle observations. Each movement was measured. Each adjustment followed reason rather than impulse. By midday, the sun had risen higher, yet the wind continued to press against the cabins. Samuel's neighbors fanned their smoke from the chimneys and made brief trips to the frozen water supply, returning with heavy pails and muttered complaints about the cold. Samuel remained inside his cabin, checking the alignment of the hearthstones and ensuring that the bedding remained within the fire's warmth. Every action, no matter how small, contributed to a controlled interior climate that his neighbors could not yet understand. Even as snow began to fall lightly in the late afternoon, Samuel persisted in his methodical preparations. The snow did not linger long on the roof, brushed off by the wind, but its presence reminded him of the pressures that would test the logic of his work. There was no hurry, no panic, only the steady repetition of tasks carried out with quiet concentration. The stage for the winter's inevitable trial had been set, each element carefully placed to meet the challenge. The cabin, modest and unassuming from the outside, reflected a deliberate order within, built entirely around the young man's understanding of heat, cold, and endurance. By mid-December, the first substantial snowfalls began to settle across the valley. Driven in by sudden gusts that carried the flakes sideways, stinging exposed faces and piling lightly against cabin walls. Frank and Joseph struggled to keep their own home sealed, hastily stuffing gaps with straw and repositioning shutters to prevent drafts. Their cabins, though well constructed, offered little resistance against the persistent wind that swept through the mountain passes. Snow accumulated unevenly along the roof lines and in corners, where drifting gusts found purchase, creating thin layers of ice that clung stubbornly to the logs. Samuel spent these days largely beside the fireplace, observing quietly the way the heat radiated from the hearthstones and circulated through the small cabin. Smoke rose in thin, steady trails, moving toward the flue and pulling warmer air along its path. He noted where cold crept first along the walls and floor, where the stones retained heat longest, and where the layering of straw offered the most insulation against the chill that seeped upward from the frozen ground. Every small observation informed minor adjustments, repositioning a stone, shifting a bundle of straw, each step executed with calm deliberation and measured purpose. Outside, Frank glanced toward Samuel's cabin as a sudden gust rattled his own door. "He'll freeze before morning," he muttered, his voice low and carried away by the wind almost as soon as it was spoken. Joseph offered no reply, focusing instead on pressing the shutters tightly and ensuring the roofline was free of heavy snow. Their attention to immediate survival contrasted sharply with Samuel's patient examination of his own methods. Yet both approaches existed within the same unforgiving environment, testing endurance and foresight in different ways. Light snow continued through the afternoon, scattering across the valley floor and masking the narrow footpaths that connected the clustered cabins. Samuel worked methodically, moving only as required, careful to conserve energy while maintaining vigilance over the cabin's thermal efficiency. Even small drafts could undermine the effort, so he monitored every subtle shift of smoke and warmth, noting where adjustments might be necessary should the weather worsen. He remained aware of each noise outside, the scraping of wood against ice, the low murmur of neighbors tending their own shelters, and the occasional crack of frozen branches in the wind. The valley itself seemed to respond to the winter's approach, the air sharp and persistent, demanding respect and attention from anyone who remained outdoors. Samuel's deliberate movements inside the cabin, combined with the careful placement of stones and straw, began to create a distinct contrast with the struggles observed in nearby cabins. While Frank and Joseph labored against drafts and slipping snow, Samuel's preparation allowed him moments of controlled observation, each small measure contributing to the slow but steady accumulation of warmth that would define the success of his approach in the nights to come. The valley remained quiet in the late afternoon, the wind sweeping steadily through the tall pines that lined the ridge above the settlement. Snowflakes drifted lazily, settling on branches and the rough-hewn roofs of cabins below. Within his modest structure, Samuel maintained a steady rhythm of attention to the hearth and surrounding stones, adjusting small shifts in bedding and straw to ensure consistent warmth. The cabin's interior was calm, with the fire providing both light and steady heat, casting shadows that moved slowly across the timber walls. Outside, the distant figures of neighbors were barely visible through the falling snow, their movements deliberate but constrained by the cold. The muffled sounds of footsteps and low conversation underscored the isolation imposed by the weather. Samuel continued his routine, checking the alignment of stones, observing smoke patterns, and monitoring the warmth near the floor where the chill pressed upward from the frozen ground. Every action was measured and deliberate, executed without haste, emphasizing careful observation and methodical preparation. At this point in the day, the narrator pauses briefly. If you're following this story, consider subscribing to see how frontier survival unfolded in extreme conditions. The line flows naturally within the measured pace of observation, offering a neutral moment of reflection without disrupting the calm, historical tone of the narrative. The valley's quiet persisted, punctuated only by the wind and the occasional sound of settling snow, reinforcing the slow-burn tension of the approaching winter trials. Samuel's focus remained uninterrupted, a quiet testament to disciplined preparation amid an indifferent landscape. January arrived abruptly, carrying with it temperatures that plunged the valley to levels seldom seen in previous winters. Night fell with a silence broken only by the howl of wind threading through the mountain passes, and the cabins of the settlement became vessels of cold that crept through every imperfect seam. Frank and Joseph huddled near their fireplaces, pulling blankets tightly around themselves and checking doors and shutters for drafts that still managed to slip through despite their efforts. Thermometers, placed near their floors and walls, registered dangerously low readings, and the persistent chill seemed almost physical, pressing against their bodies with relentless insistence. Inside his own cabin, Samuel remained beside the hearth, his careful arrangements of stones radiating heat in steady waves. The temperature near the hearth was measurably higher than the surrounding spaces, providing a zone of consistent warmth. Every stone retained a portion of the fire's energy and released it slowly, counteracting the severe cold that dominated the night beyond the cabin walls. He shifted occasionally, adjusting his position to maintain contact with the areas most affected by cold drafts, ensuring that his body stayed within the optimal warmth of the hearth's influence. The contrast between his cabin and those nearby was striking. From the outside, the logs and smoke of Samuel's dwelling appeared no different from the others, yet the interior conditions told a different story. Snow and ice continued to accumulate along rooftops and around door frames, yet within, he maintained a comfort level that was nearly 40 centigrade warmer than the homes of his neighbors. The meticulous placement of stones and bedding, the careful sealing of gaps, and the observation of airflow had combined to create an interior climate that the valley's winter could not easily overcome. Even as he maintained warmth, Samuel kept watch on the small details: how smoke traveled along the flue, how heat shifted along the walls, and how each stone held the warmth from the fire. His neighbors, peering briefly through windows or stepping outside to glance at his cabin, could only remark with restrained astonishment, "How can he possibly stay warm like that?" Their words were few, reflecting not hostility, but the quiet acknowledgement of an unexpected effectiveness. The wind's moan increased as the night deepened, and ice formed on the edges of roofs and window sills. Samuel's presence by the hearth was steady, practical, and methodical, requiring neither movement nor exaggeration to assert its effect. The valley itself seemed to acknowledge the efficiency of his preparation, the snow and cold pressing equally on all cabins, yet producing a markedly different experience for those who had anticipated it. The winter's pressure, relentless and exacting, had begun to test Samuel's methods in full, revealing the quiet triumph of foresight, patience, and disciplined action. The mountain wind increased in intensity, sweeping across the valley with relentless force. Snow accumulated in deep drifts against cabins, forming small banks that pressed against doors and windows. Icicles hung from eaves, growing steadily as melting snow refroze in the bitter cold. Samuel remained inside his modest log cabin, methodically observing the interaction of heat and structure. He noted how warmth radiated from the hearthstones and how the airflow carried heat to the far corners of the room. Every minor adjustment, shifting a bundle of straw, repositioning a stone, was recorded mentally, a careful exercise in sustaining consistent comfort. Henry and Robert, moving between their own cabins, began to notice the difference. While their interiors offered only intermittent relief from the cold, Samuel's cabin maintained a steady, measurable warmth. From a distance, Henry paused, observing smoke curling steadily from the flue, and remarked quietly, "He's doing something we've not tried ourselves." Robert nodded, adjusting his scarf, the words unspoken, but the acknowledgement clear. The contrast between preparation and happenstance became evident as snow pressed against walls and the wind rattled shutters. Inside, Samuel continued his watch over the cabin's thermal behavior. He observed the smoke as it rose and twisted along the flue, the slow transfer of heat from stone to air, and the subtle changes as cold crept along the lower walls. The cabin's small interior was quiet, punctuated only by the hiss of the fire and the occasional groan of timber settling under snow's weight. Each observation informed minor corrections, ensuring the hearth remained the central point of controlled warmth. The valley's conditions were unyielding. Outside, snow drifted in sharp gusts, accumulating against logs and creating uneven layers across roofs. Icicles grew longer and heavier as temperatures remained low. Yet inside Samuel's cabin, the consistent warmth persisted. He worked steadily, applying the knowledge gained from previous days' observations, adjusting the internal arrangement with precise care. Every action was practical and measured, each directed at maintaining an environment insulated from the mountain's harsh extremes. By late afternoon, the contrast between cabins could no longer be ignored. Henry and Robert, previously skeptical, paused to acknowledge Samuel's methods, noting the evident stability of warmth within his walls. No celebration was expressed. The recognition was quiet, understated, and factual, consistent with the serious demands of survival in this remote environment. Samuel's methodical observations and adjustments had transformed the modest cabin into a model of controlled endurance, demonstrating the practical application of foresight, preparation, and calm, disciplined action against an unrelenting winter. The night arrived with sudden ferocity, a blizzard sweeping across the valley with howling gusts that pushed snow against every cabin wall. Roof lines disappeared beneath accumulations of powder, and pathways between structures became indistinguishable under the shifting drifts. Frank and Joseph struggled to keep doors operable, snow piled high against timbers, ice forming in thick layers along eaves and windowsills. Their cabins, though well built, succumbed to the relentless weight and intrusion of winter, interiors dropping to temperatures that forced constant movement just to maintain basic warmth. Samuel remained beside the hearth, his body positioned carefully among the stones he had so meticulously arranged. The fire radiated steadily, and the layering of straw along the floor ensured that warmth reached every corner of the small cabin. Smoke rose evenly along the flue, carrying heat in a consistent pattern that maintained a comfort level notably higher than any other home in the settlement. The blizzard's force outside had little influence over the controlled interior climate he had engineered. Morning revealed the extent of the storm's impact. Cabins nearby were buried partially under snow, entrances blocked, and interiors frigid despite the occupants' exertions. Samuel's door opened easily, the interior air tempered and dry. He had remained awake for part of the night, adjusting bedding and stones only when necessary to maintain steady warmth. The proof of his foresight was immediate and observable. He had endured conditions that rendered others uncomfortable. His methodical approach validated by the stark contrast outside. Neighbors entered to assess the damage, moving carefully through drifts and snow-laden approaches. Henry paused at the doorway, looking into Samuel's cabin where the hearth burned steadily, and the young man sat composed beside it. Robert followed silently, noting the measured arrangement of stones and straw. Dialogue was minimal, factual, and restrained. "Remarkable," Henry said, quietly observing the controlled warmth. Robert added only a nod, the recognition of success understated yet clear. No celebration, no exaggeration, only acknowledgement of what preparation and attention to detail had accomplished under extreme conditions. Samuel remained attentive but unhurried, noting where slight adjustments were needed as snow continued to pile against the walls outside. The interior remained steady, a quiet testament to methodical planning and patience. The blizzard had tested the limits of the settlement's preparation, and Samuel's cabin stood as proof that careful observation, disciplined work, and practical foresight could endure even the harshest of winter conditions. As the valley gradually emerged from the grip of winter, signs of the season's severity became evident. Cabins that had been poorly insulated showed frost damage along walls and floors. Thinly constructed roofs had sagged under the accumulated snow, and some piping had frozen, leaving traces of water stains and minor structural failure. Neighbors moved cautiously, repairing doors and windows, shifting snow away from entrances, and assessing the lingering effects of weeks spent under relentless cold. Samuel's cabin, in contrast, remained largely intact. The careful preparation of stones, straw, and hearth positioning had mitigated damage, leaving the interior both warm and structurally sound. Community figures who had observed Samuel's methods throughout the winter now nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Henry inspected the cabin walls and hearthstones, noting the precise alignment that had preserved warmth. Robert, moving between cabins, adjusted shutters and commented on minor repairs, each observation underscoring the difference between forethought and reactive measures. Frank and Joseph continued their work to restore their own homes, the severity of frost and snow serving as a tangible reminder of the mountain's indifference to unpreparedness. Decades later, Clarence, now elderly, would recall the winter of 1893 with clarity. He remembered the methodical calm of Samuel, the quiet diligence applied to every stone and straw bundle, and the small yet consistent heat that radiated from the hearth. To Clarence, Samuel's approach became an example of practical foresight, demonstrating how measured observation and restrained effort could withstand the harshest environmental pressures. The memory of Samuel's cabin, standing warm and habitable amid widespread frost damage, persisted as a lesson in preparation and endurance. The valley itself settled back into its seasonal rhythm. Snowmelt ran slowly along narrow paths, and the pines recovered from ice-laden branches. Samuel continued his routine, no longer under the immediate threat of blizzard or deep freeze, yet maintaining the principles of care and methodical attention that had ensured survival. The quiet respect of his neighbors and the lasting acknowledgement from witnesses like Clarence reflected the enduring rewards of deliberate, restrained preparation. The winter's consequences were visible across the settlement, yet the benefits of foresight and disciplined action were equally clear, offering a measured testament to the practical resilience of one young man in the face of extreme conditions. Years after the severe winter of 1893, the practice Samuel had employed, sleeping beside the hearth to preserve consistent warmth, remained part of the oral history within the valley. Settlers spoke of the modest log cabin that had withstood the blizzard when others faltered, the small interior where stones and straw had been arranged with deliberate care. The story circulated quietly, observed through the lens of practical survival rather than embellishment. Samuel's methodical approach, noted for its patience and attentiveness, became an example cited whenever newcomers faced the valley's winter months. Elders recalled his quiet diligence, the meticulous attention to airflow and heat distribution, and the way he had remained calm amid extreme conditions. Children learned not through lectures, but through observation of these practices repeated in subsequent winters. Each hearthside sleeping arrangement replicated by later settlers emphasized steady warmth and careful preparation, reflecting lessons grounded in observation rather than speculation. The valley's survival culture was informed by these small, deliberate actions, carried forward through practical demonstration and spoken memory. Those who had witnessed Samuel's approach firsthand, including figures like Clarence, recounted the importance of foresight and the disciplined management of interior spaces. Henry and Robert, having survived alongside him, reinforced the value of observation and patience. Discussions of his methods were factual and restrained: how stones conducted heat, how straw insulation preserved warmth, and how positioning near the hearth allowed consistent endurance against cold. The focus remained on the functional application of knowledge rather than narrative flourish. Over time, the practice became normalized among the settlement's winter preparations. Samuel's example reinforced that careful attention, deliberate action, and sustained observation offered measurable advantages in frontier survival. The legacy was not of heroism or spectacle, but of practical methodology that could be repeated and relied upon. By maintaining a calm, methodical approach, settlers preserved both warmth and structure, ensuring resilience through the harshest conditions. The valley's historical memory retained these lessons as guidance for future winters, a record of measured discipline translating into tangible survival outcomes. Even decades later, when oral histories were recounted around fireplaces, Samuel's name remained associated with quiet competence, methodical preparation, and the careful management of environmental risk. The valley itself, shaped by repeated winters, carried traces of his approach. Small hearths arranged for efficiency, straw layered along floors, and the practice of observation over reaction. These elements, simple yet effective, ensured that the lessons of that winter persisted, embedded within the practical knowledge of the frontier community.